When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He'll put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was ill, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you ill or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me."
Poverty in Britain is a hotly debated subject, no shortage of opinion or emotion. Stigmatisation of the poor is on the rise. The political parties seem deeply divided in their analysis both of the problem and the solutions. The charity sector has been a frequent voice of concern and protest over policies. Then there are the churches. This was perhaps the surprising and unexpected story of the early 21st century. Just when secularists and cynics were expecting the apparently declining church to sail off into the sunset, it's done the exact opposite. Churches have mobilised themselves in an extraordinary way in recent years to address issues of poverty and other needs too across the country. Think of the food bank movement, mental health support, the significance of the work of Christians Against Poverty and its projects throughout the country, including here in this valley. If we cast our minds back just 20 years or so, our country was awash with optimism. All the talk was of ambitious schemes to tackle the huge problems of poverty in the developing world. Now, these were and they are essential goals and things the Western world must play a major part in tackling. You may remember campaigns focused on cancelling unpayable debts of developing nations and the continued need to tackle environmental issues, maximising international aid and curtailing the power of multinational companies who took advantage of poor nations. Things are very different now. In the UK in the last 10 years, possibly less, food banks have become commonplace, haven't they? Even areas such as around us, where many people have disposable incomes, now find themselves with food banks, and food banks which are very busy. So alongside the absolutely essential need to support and free the developing world, more and more energy has been turned to our own backyard here in Britain and to the challenges people are facing. We can probably trace this back to the credit crunch and ensuing recession of 2008. That wasn't just a brief economic blip, rather it was a systematic failure with serious long-term consequences. And here we are now, 14 years on from that financial crisis, experiencing something which is perhaps even more significant, or at least equally so. The rise of the cost of living, of energy bills and fuel is beginning to affect many people, and we're told that it will only get harder for all sorts of reasons. For some, of course, that will mean less disposable income. It won't make a difference to being able to have to heat the house or put food on the table for some, but for others it will make a huge difference. People are going to be led or forced into real poverty, unable to pay for their most basic needs. Make no mistake, this is a crisis, and it's something which the Christian faith has a lot to say about. As such, it's something that the churches in this country really have to engage with, alongside organisations such as food banks and other partners such as Christians Against Poverty. There's an important distinction, though, to make in this debate, and that is the difference between absolute and relative poverty. Virtually all commentators accept that there is a distinction here. Absolute poverty means the lack of the most essential basic needs just for pure survival: shelter, clothing, food, clean water. That's a lack that fundamentally threatens health and well-being and even life itself. African farmers whose crops have comprehensively failed and are absolutely poor. Homeless refugees are absolutely poor. Victims of modern slavery are absolutely poor, as are many victims of severe flooding and other environmental disasters. This is obvious, but the needs of the absolutely poor throughout the world must be a top priority for followers of Jesus. Nothing should diminish the mandate for Christians to play our part in the eradication of absolute poverty wherever we can. If any of you watched the live or video versions of Matt Norton's recent live streams on his trip to Kenya, you'll not have been able to help but be moved by what we saw there, by standards of living which are beyond most of our comprehension, and the great work they are doing. But it's a false dichotomy really to set absolute poverty elsewhere against less extreme, what we might call relative poverty here in the UK. This isn't either or. Relative poverty has hundreds of impact on hundreds and hundreds of people, maybe less likely to kill them, but it can very much destroy or damage their lives. We can't ignore our neighbours in our communities simply because of the needs of those in developing nations. It really is both and for Christians, not either or. So we mustn't use our donations to African projects as an excuse to walk by on the other side of the road, ignoring the rough sleeper on the high street of Huddersfield and other towns and cities. Jesus just does not leave that open to us. He makes it abundantly plain that we are to help the person there in front of us. There are three key reasons, I think, why poverty in the UK should matter for Christians. Firstly, it's a scandal that hundreds of thousands of people in our country, a country as rich as ours, can't afford sufficient nutritious food or to adequately heat their homes. It's a serious situation that we have such deep financial insecurity or that people are overloaded with such debt. It's a serious matter if people are excluded from society because they can't afford to take part in the most simple leisure and social pursuits. Such things divide society and demoralise the poorest. What would Jesus' response be? Would he turn the blind eye? Would he walk away and pass on the other side? Well, of course not. He would spend time with the person in need. He would seek to meet their needs. We are Christians and we are seeking to become more and more like Jesus. So the decisions that we make are an indicator of whether we are indeed becoming more like him or whether we're not. In our reading today, he tells us that whenever we help the poor, the needy, the downtrodden, it's as if we are doing those things for Jesus himself. Throughout his time on earth, Jesus showed concern for physical and social needs as well as spiritual ones. He fed the hungry, he healed the sick. He welcomed and accepted the outcasts of society. He loved those who no one else did. And of course, it's a constant theme throughout the Old Testament too. Let me just give you two quick examples. This is a well-known one from the prophet Micah, chapter 6, verse 8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Or here in Deuteronomy chapter 15. For there will never cease to be poor in the land. Therefore I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy and to the poor who are in your land. This is the God who we serve. This is why we need to be a church for the poor. We pray the Lord's Prayer regularly, don't we? Maybe even daily. And in it we pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as in heaven. God's kingdom is a place where no one is in need, where God's will is done on earth as in heaven. And this then is the job of the church, to be agents of that kingdom. Secondly, the best available research suggests that poverty is on the increase. And we know that to be true from the news every day, don't we? The gap between the rich and the poor seems to be widening, and that's a trend that seems to have been with us for a fair while. Again, is this something that we can ignore as Christians? Thirdly, It's a serious matter that the rise of poverty has gone hand in hand with the hardening of some people's, not everyone's, but some people's attitudes towards the poor. Thankfully, it's not everyone, but some do have a tendency to stigmatise the poor and blame them for their plight. Poverty isn't only an economic phenomenon, it's about resources. Can everyone live viably in our society? Now, there are other types of poverty too, which follow on from the economic. There's aspirational poverty, the loss of hope, where people get so low that they lose hope that things could ever be different. Aspiration is about believing that positive change is not only desirable, but it's possible. And once people lose that hope, it's a tragedy. And there's relational poverty too, which is the loss of real community. Human beings are social creatures. We know that as Christians, don't we? God calls us into community. So it's essential if we're to flourish as human beings, to connect with other human beings. And then there's spiritual poverty, the ultimate loss of meaning. A cold wind of secularism has blown through our nation, and it's swept away a fair bit of our Christian heritage bit by bit. Spiritual poverty is an acute problem for the poor. There can be so little to fall back on when there's a lack of spiritual values. It can lead to a real bleak outlook on life. A materialistic society just cannot feed what people really, really need. To be a church for the poor, then, we have to start by facing the real and urgent need of the poor in our nation, in our communities, as well as abroad. And once we face it, we need to act. We need to get involved in helping the poor, in listening to them, into responding to the things which cause poverty and which arise as a result of poverty. We need to be willing, where necessary, to stand up for the poor. We need to be a secure and welcoming place for the poor within all our church communities, where people can respond to the call of Christ to be part of the solution to the problems of this world, to be part of the community and family of the church, as we seek to follow Jesus as he seeks to put right what is wrong with the world. So let me just finish with a few questions which I think we need to come to a collective mind on as church communities. Maybe you've got some questions to add too. Do let me know. But how about to get us started? What are the real needs here in our local community? Where and how are people really hurting? What resources do we have, especially in terms of skills and talents and energy, which we could use to make a difference to others? How does God want us here in our community then to truly be a church for the poor?